Thank you, Billy Aaron, for asking me to speak today. I do so on behalf of my wife, Edwina, and so many others who cannot be in this church because of the terrible coronavirus pandemic. If not for that, we would surely be in the Braves Stadium with an overflowing crowd as we send Henry off today. Now, there's an angel among us who has lifted him to so many heights far above the baseball field. Billy Aaron is a superstar herself, a genuine force of nature, civil rights leader, head of the United Negro College Fund, former anchor woman and journalist, civic leader extraordinaire, role model for generations of young women and men. Her dynamic personality so complemented the quiet, more private nature of Henry. How fortunate he was to have Billy at his side. Thank you, Billy, for loving Henry so much as you did, and for enabling him to soar into the heavens, which is where he is today. Now, among the greatest athletes of the 20th century, my friend Henry Aaron always will rank first in my record book. He was a superstar with unblemished character and unquestioned integrity. He accomplished his triumphant feat of breaking Babe Ruth's home run record without the use of performance-enhancing drugs. He did it while racists threatened his life and the lives of his family. Then Henry and Billy created the Chasing the Dream Foundation so that highly promising young students could chase and hopefully reach their own lifetime dreams. If there ever was a finer human being on this planet than Henry, I do not know who that was. Humble, caring, courageous, loving, a quiet giant who was a fierce champion of civil rights and social justice. Henry exemplified what it means to be a genuine American hero. He never disappointed us on the field of play or off. Never, not even once. We have lost, and heaven has gained, one of the very best that our world contained. Thank you.